Okay, let's get started as people are still coming in, but there's quite a number come in by now. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jane Millar. I'm Professor of Social Policy at the University of Bath, and it's my great pleasure to be in the chair for this afternoon's webinar, hosted by the Bristol University Press, with the title Rethinking Welfare in the Context of COVID-19. 1 year in, very timely, I think, to be addressing these issues and also to be taking a longer look at the future, which is what we're going to be doing today. So as 1 year in, we can see the impact on health, on society has been immense. COVID-19 has highlighted many inequalities and also many gaps in our welfare state. We've got an amazing panel here to reflect on where we are, where we might be going and where we should be going in the future. So let me say a few words of introduction to our three panel members and then I'm going to hand over to them. So first of all, Stewart Lansley, economist and journalist and a visiting fellow at the School of Policy Studies, University of Bristol. Stewart is well known for his research and publications on the issues of poverty and inequality over many years. This includes his 2019 book with Howard Reed on the very topical issue of universal basic income. Then we have Sam Royston, Policy and Research Director at Marie Curie. He's worked on the front line at Citizens Advice and was until recently Policy Director at the Children's Society. He's a former chair of the End Child Poverty Coalition. His 2017 book, Broken Benefits, What's Wrong with the Welfare Reform, analyses the problems with the current system, but also puts forward, as he puts it, practical ideas for reform to create a fairer, simpler and more coherent system for the future. And our third panellist is Chris Pierson, Emeritus Professor of Politics at the University of Nottingham. Chris has worked across the world in his career, America, Australia, New Zealand, Germany. He's written many influential books on the welfare state, and his new book, The Next Welfare State, UK Welfare After COVID, is due out in the autumn. So I think you'll agree that we've got a great panel to start reflecting on these issues. They're going to speak for 10 minutes each, one after the other. Please put your questions into the question and answer, and I'll be asking questions at the end. If you've got any queries or any technical issues, put those in the chat, put questions in the question and answer, please. I'm going to hand over at that point to Stewart, first of all. So Stewart, your 10 minutes starting now.
Okay, well, thanks very much to Bristol University Press for organising this, and thanks everybody for joining us. The issue is certainly a hot topic, although, there's nothing new about the debate about the welfare state. We've had, ever since the war, we've had endless discussions about whether there is or isn't a crisis in the welfare state. In some ways, this one feels different. And I think, for several reasons. First, it comes at the end of a series of shocks that we've had over the last 3 or 4 decades. Deindustrialization, the 2008 crash, the austerity, Brexit, and the effect of these, rolling shocks have been, really to have a big impact on people's livelihoods, people's incomes, people's life chances. And also, I think what they've done is what COVID has done is expose some of the multiple flaws that we have in our social state at the moment. And let's just go through those flaws. I mean, the benefit system we now know is mean, is patchy, it's highly punitive. Unemployment benefit for a single person is 13% of average earnings. It's more like 50% in other European countries. Our public services, we know, parts of our public services are deeply have had real problems with resources, and are particularly things like children's service and elderly services are increasingly frail. Not only have we got a problem with the benefit system, but I think that the problem of inequality and the impact of inequality on how people are affected has been really exposed. So and the result of, I think, these problems, these shocks, the failures of the social state, is that we have near post-war peak levels of both poverty and inequality. And I think that what we've had in Britain for the last 4 decades is essentially a high poverty, high inequality cycle, and there's no sense that that's going to end. So if we're going to look to the future and we're going to say, you know, how are we going to try and rebuild the social state? Well, a lot of people have been talking about going back to beverage, haven't they? A lot of people are saying, you know, we need either a new beverage plan, or we need to we need the beverage, or we could say the beverage Attlee vision. Um, and what I think my thoughts on that are that in part yes, and in part no. There's no doubt that beverage central principle was that we should create a national social minimum below which nobody would fall. In his terms, they would be delivered through a mix of cash benefits, free health care, and full employment, but also sort of buoyant wages and affordable rents. I think, you know, that is a very important principle. The problem is, of course, it's never been fully implemented, and for a variety of reasons. So, you know, we've moved away from his key principle of universalism to reliance on means testing. The principle of entitlement built into the system has been eroded. Um, and we've also had problems with the tax benefit system because of the uh, increasingly regressive nature of the tax system, which means that the tax benefit system as a whole is much less progressive and therefore much less powerful at fighting poverty as it was immediately after the war. And there's a second problem with Beveridge, and that is that he ignored the question of inequality altogether. He believed that, you know, the priority was to solve destitution and deprivation, and not to worry about what was happening at the top. Well, I think that we know the experience of the last 40 years has told us that there is a critical link between inequality and poverty, and that what's happening at the top, or the mechanisms used to enrich people, have had a big impact on what's happening at the bottom. So so looking forward and thinking about how we're going to plan a post-COVID future, I just want to say I think that it should have three elements. Some of them draw on Beveridge and some of them don't. The first is, I think we need to go back to this idea of a national social minimum. Um, but unlike the Beveridge scheme, this should be guaranteed, it should be automatic, and it should be non-means tested. And it should start with a cash floor. I think what we need to do is integrate a universal income floor. It can be quite low, on which the rest of the system can base. And that means everybody will have a certain level of income guaranteed, which means they can plan, they can have more choices and so on. And the work that we've done with how I've done with Howard Reid suggests it'd be perfectly possible to implement a fairly modest scheme at modest cost that would actually have a significant impact on poverty and inequality and the level of means testing. The second thing we need to do is improve the progressivity of the tax benefit system. So in combination, these reforms of the benefit system plus a more progressive tax system, which would mean the tax benefit system as a whole would be more effective than it is at the moment. But I think the third thing we need is to recognize that income redistribution on its own is not going to be enough to tackle the scale of the problem that we have. We therefore need to look to asset redistribution as well as income redistribution. Now, the total level of wealth in Britain is seven times the level of national income. It was about 3 times in the 60s and 70s. So we've had this great surge in the level of wealth. Nearly all this great surge has gone to the top. Quite a lot of it is unearned, and it's very, very lightly taxed. So the total level of taxation on wealth is something like an average of 3%, despite the size of wealth. And yet we tax incomes at around 30%. It doesn't really make very much sense. And also, wealth is much more unequal than incomes. So the top 10% have around 50% of all wealth. The bottom 40% have about 6%. Now, if we look at something there's a particularly useful indicator of inequality is something called the Palmer ratio. And the Palmer ratio measures the share of the top 10% divided by the share of the bottom 40%. And the Palmer ratio for wealth is 10. The Palmer ratio for income is 1.5. So, in other words, the top 10% have 10 times more wealth than the bottom 40%. So the scope for resource generation, for creating greater equality, is huge. So I do think, as well as trying to do something to make a more effective income support system, we very much need the resources. It will have to increasingly come from wealth. Okay, I probably had my time up, so I'm going to hand over to Sam now, I think.
Thanks, Stewart. I think a lot of that kind of are things that I can build on in my own presentation. I kind of want to start with, though very much is very, very wrong with social security provision. I wanted to begin with some of what's gone right over the pandemic. Social security has once again proved its critical role in simply enabling people to carry on. For example, in some weeks of the initial period of the pandemic, there was a 10-fold increase in the number of people making claims for universal credit. There was one fortnight where the DWP said they handled around 950,000 claims. Overall, just as a sense of scale, in March 2020, about 3 million people were on universal credit. The numbers have basically doubled by November 2020. Without the social security system in place, alongside other measures which provided some protection for livelihoods, the scale of destitution which would have been wrought during this pandemic is simply unthinkable. It shows us once again the crucial role that the social security system plays in supporting people's livelihood. At the same time, some critical measures, additional measures, were introduced, which helped to further support livelihoods through the crisis. The most obvious is the £20 per week uplift in the standard allowance for universal credit. Absolutely critical support for workers and non-workers alike under the new benefit system. Help with rent for people in the private rented sector was increased back to alignment with the 30th percentile of local rents, where it was some years ago. Benefit sanctions were temporarily suspended, and hundreds of millions of pounds of additional support was provided to local authorities to provide additional destitution support, including through so-called local welfare assistance schemes. But much has gone really wrong. The £20 increase in universal credit is time limited. Despite a short extension this year in the budget, it's still expected to disappear in the near future. In addition, it only provides an allocation per household. So those with higher levels of need, such as those with children, received a proportionally smaller increase in their income than others. Furthermore, the uplift wasn't extended to non-working households in receipt of legacy benefits. So many of those not yet on universal credit did not see any increase in their benefit entitlement. An application of the benefit cap has soared, in part because though the universal credit standard allowance was increased, the level of the cap did not, meaning that some people who got more in universal credit just had it taken away through the benefit cap. The additional provision through the local welfare assistance scheme to address destitution runs out next month, despite little sign of destitution abating. And similarly, despite last year's increase in the level of local housing allowance, rates of support are now being frozen again from this year onwards. And of course, there have been many people not entitled to support through the mainstream benefit system at all, because they have so-called no recourse to public funds, who have often been in the most insecure positions in the labour market and have not benefited from any of the additional support provided through the social security measures outlined. So this leads to the question of what needs to be done for the future. Well, firstly, the government needs to improve the adequacy of social security provision overall. The pandemic has exposed real inadequacy in the levels of support available to many new claimants. However, to a degree, in reality, this is not a new challenge. It's just yet another reminder of things we've already known. The delinking of local housing allowance from local rents seriously needs looking at again. Whilst reattaching benefits to local rents was welcome, albeit it didn't go back to the 50th percentile of local rents that it was at a decade ago, we're simply going to go through the same process over again as we watch the rates of support fall further and further behind local rents if they continue to be frozen into the future. The localization of social security needs really close consideration. For many years, key aspects of the social security system have been increasingly localized, from localization of council tax benefit through to abolition of key parts of the so-called discretionary social fund, which have helped people, particularly at times of particular crisis. But there's been little thinking about how effective replacements can be put in place at a local level. And councils have seen very little additional funding that they've needed in order to provide effective replacement schemes. In many parts of the country, those local welfare assistance schemes have been disappearing year by year. Failure to properly fund local systems of provision over the last decade, at a time when councils have also been under massive pressure anyway, with reductions in children's and adult services budgets as well, have created just huge pressures. We need to make sure that if we're going to continue, and that's put the whole system in a position where the additional funding for local welfare assistance, though welcome, has come to councils who haven't been set up to deliver effective schemes of support. It would have been much better if that thinking had gone in some years ago into how that kind of provision could be managed. We also need to keep a really close eye on sanctions use. In my book, I looked at how increases in sanctions use have historically tended to increase in proportion to the number of out-of-work benefit claimants. Sanctions were, of course, suspended in the first part of the pandemic and only very gradually being lifted. But as we start to recover from the pandemic, particularly if there are rocky roads ahead economically, we may well be very concerned that the government start to use sanctions again as a tool to move people into employment. And that's not what they're intended to be there for. So something we really need to consider for the near future. Finally, I work for the charity Marie Curie, which supports people affected by terminal illness and their loved ones. And perhaps in this year, like no other, our minds have turned to the experiences of those affected by death, dying and bereavement. But too many people affected by death, dying and bereavement do not receive the support that they need. So, for example, the special rules for terminal illness, which enables people living with terminal illness to get expedited access to the benefit system, are extremely limited in scope. And there are many people who miss out simply because they don't meet the very limited criteria for who can get access under those rules. The government have promised to kind of look again at that. But we're seeing very slow progress on that, and action really is needed on that. And at the same time, with millions of people left bereaved over the course of the last year, it's a real reminder that there's much more work that needs to be done to effectively financially support people after bereavement. So in conclusion, there's very much to be thankful for that we have some social security system available. It's such a critical part of the of society, of the welfare state, of what makes communities great and enables us to support one another. But there is so much to be furious about in terms of the adequacy of support offered for it. Without a social security system which is fit for the future recovery from the pandemic, is going to be very hard indeed. And I will now hand over to Chris.
Sam, thank you very much. I hadn't realized that you're going to be able to see us as well as hear us. So I wrote some notes which I was going to read to you, and I'm probably still going to do that. So I'll just say hello to you now and then disappear into what I'm going to do. But I'm going to keep my remarks fairly straightforward. And I want to talk a little bit about the kind of wider welfare economy, both in the COVID period and beyond it. And I just want to make 5 points. When I used to lecture, students liked it if you only made a number. Sure, no, if you make 5 points, they might write them down. So first point, we need to remind ourselves that the new normal is not normal. In the aftermath of the great financial crisis of 2008, you might remember the budget deficit reached about 10% of GDP. In 2021, it's around 17%. The public debt was around 75% in the aftermath of the great financial crisis. It's now in excess of 100% and destined to stay there for some time. In early 2020, 10 years of painstaking austerity, do you remember those? Justified by the perilous position of the public finances after the financial crisis, were blown away in the space of a couple of months. And when COVID struck in 2020, we were still living with the economic consequences of that crisis of 2008. The financial impact of the latest crisis will last at least 20 years, probably much longer. And that's if the vaccine program enables us to establish some sort of new normal. The second point, the state is always with us. When the chips are down, only the state has the power and the resources to manage a crisis like this. It was true in 2008. It's still more true in 2021. In the early summer of 2020, nearly 9 million people were having most of their wages paid by the state. And in the last instance, social distancing was a practice which was enforced by the state's coercive apparatus. Meanwhile, the government has spent something like £7,000 per household to get us through 2020. So we might not like living with a government that suspends basic civil liberties, as we have for the last year, and we may think its management of the crisis has been more or less botched, but no one has made a halfway plausible case for managing the COVID crisis in any other way. The third point I want to make is that the big welfare state is here to stay. Some of us are old enough to remember when the Conservative promise was to be the party of the small state. It never was, but even the distant spectre of smallness has now disappeared. Although the March budget made quite modest inroads on the new public debt, Rishi Sunak's anticipated tax rises made this prospectively the largest tax state since 1969. Of course, the intention is that much of the new welfare state will be temporary as the world of work reopens, and public expenditure totals beyond 2022 reflect that aspiration. But given the slowness of the economic recovery after 2010, we have good reason to doubt that things will right themselves very quickly. And it remains the case that the cost base of the underlying or permanent welfare state will just continue to rise. The welfare state is at its core a system of income maintenance and health and social care for older people. Despite the frightening toll that COVID has taken in this older population, we will continue to age societally. So far, the Chancellor and the government have taken no steps to moderate the pensions triple lock. Until and unless they do, this part of the public economy looks set to grow faster than the economy overall in the future, as it has over the past decade. And this has to represent a rising cost for the public exchequer. The fourth point, which has been alluded to already, the impact of COVID is unequal. Across a range of indicators, we can see that the impact, whether looked at clinically or economically, has been quite uneven, and that it reflected existing inequalities of wealth and opportunity. Of course, deaths were heavily concentrated amongst the over 75s, but there were other criteria which pointed to higher levels of morbidity. So rates were strikingly high in Black and minority ethnic populations, with Black men especially vulnerable. In the first wave, levels of mortality in the most deprived English locations were twice as high as those in the least deprived areas. Those in manual occupations experienced a higher incidence of the disease and were generally less able to continue to work from home. Heavy lobbying kept the £20 uplift in universal credit in place at least until September, but those on legacy benefits did not share in this upgrading, and the annual increase in standard welfare benefits in April 2021 was tiny, in some instances less than 50p a week. All of which brings me to the fifth and most important point, which is that COVID does not change everything. I've written here, so it must be true, there are not many reliable laws in the social sciences, but here is one: nothing changes everything. COVID-19 will have an impact, not least on our welfare state arrangements that last for at least a generation. It's just possible that public attitudes to state and welfare will have been changed, as many millions of workers have been for the first time dependent upon the state for an income, but maybe not. The state of the public finances will certainly have changed for the very much worse. This crisis in the public finances seemed to present a chance to do something different and interesting and perhaps more progressive with the tax system, but it looks as though that isn't going to happen. Rishi Sunak has introduced the largest single increase in taxation for a generation. Most of that burden has fallen upon corporation tax, along with some effective increases in income tax yields. But corporation tax is not just a tax upon firms. They are the end payers, but the costs will fall upon various others, including workers and those who buy what firms produce. And these increases have been deferred for 2 years, while corporations enjoy a generous investment incentive in the shorter term. There was, I think, here an opportunity to change the shape of the tax economy in various ways. Above all, a chance to transfer some of that burden onto wealth, the point that Stewart was making just a few minutes ago. Wealth which we know to have become much more unequally owned in Britain over the past 40 years. So the Chancellor could have introduced a wealth tax or reformed capital gains tax, or done something to tax the transmission of unearned wealth across generations more effectively. But even under the most acute fiscal stress, he chose not to do this. So I think the core problem that underlay welfare in the UK before COVID-19 was that wealth rather than income is so unequally distributed. Britain is a wealthy country with a large number of poor people, including millions of poor children. And after COVID-19, that underlying problem remains just the same. To address that, we need to redistribute wealth. And to do that, we need to reallocate the ownership of property. Tax and spend will not do it. No government was willing to make that change before COVID arrived. And I'm afraid there's absolutely no sign that any government after COVID is going to take the action that we need. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much to our three speakers who have not only been great timekeepers, but have also given us lots of things to think about and discuss. Let me just pick out a few points that struck me as they were going through. One was the way in which we entered this with not a very good system. So we entered this with a system that had already suffered lots of cuts and had lots of gaps in it. So we weren't in a good position when we started. The second, I think Sam's point about the importance of social security is incredibly important. I mean, social security is essential. It's as essential as any other health service or anything else that we provide in the welfare state. It really means a lot, makes a lot of difference. And the third one, of course, is the other problems aren't going away. Issues of the aging population and inequalities and differentials and so on are all there as well. And they're possibly heightened by COVID, but they're certainly not going away. So we can't forget the problems that we hadn't already solved, if you know what I mean, in terms of thinking of solutions in relation to COVID-19. So questions are coming up. I'll try and get through as many as I can, but forgive me if I don't get to all of them, because I want to give our speakers plenty of time. But let's start with where Stewart finished in a way, which is universal basic income, because lots of people have said universal basic income is the idea, but then there's a question here about should we be thinking of universal basic income or universal basic services or both? And if we were thinking of universal basic income, what sort of level are we talking about? can we really introduce what you talked a little bit about, a lowish, modest level, but what sort of level would really make any difference? So I'm going to ask Stewart first, and then I want to ask Chris and Sam also to reflect on whether they are in favour of universal basic income as the answer here. So Stewart first, services, income, and what sort of level?
Okay, well, I mean, the question of universal basic income, I mean, there are two, there's lots of versions of UBI around, but I think it's helpful to look at two different alternatives. One is a sort of big bang scheme, which would effectively, replace the whole of the existing social security system, would be paid at very generous levels, would be very, very expensive. Or there's more modest change, which, we at Compass, where we've been doing this work, we prefer to call it a kind of plimsoll line. A basic floor is still a basic income in the sense it's guaranteed and it goes to everybody, which would be grafted onto the existing system. So you'd have means testing on top of it, but it would be very, and it really would implement the principle that Beveridge set out, which has never been implemented, which there would be a guaranteed floor. And the figures we're looking at are £40 for a child and £60 for an adult. That means for a family of 4, 2 adults and 2 children, that's the equivalent of £10,400 a year. Now, clearly, that's not enough to live on, but it's not bad if you know it's always going to come, and that would be empowering. You give people choices, and you could raise it over time. And we've tried to make calculations about how it could rise over time. So we see this as a way of implementing Beveridge. We see this as a way of saying, here's a floor. We've designed it in such a way that it could be revenue neutral, i.e. there would be no net increase in taxation. But to do that, it would be highly progressive, and it would redistribute quite a lot from the top 20% to the bottom third. So now the national social minimum, I mean, Beveridge's model of the social minimum had both cash benefits and a free health service. So it had both it it had cash benefits and a universal basic service. And I don't see, I mean, most advocates of basic income are not against universal basic services. I think there is a very strong case that we should extend them. And certainly, social care and childcare both seem important candidates. So we don't see them in competition. And of course, we've got resource constraints. And we're not going to be doing this. We see this very much as a kind of 10, 15-year plan to rebuild the income support system, firing on both cylinders, a basic income and basic services. So that's where we're coming from.
Right, thanks. Sam?
It's a really interesting question. I guess my answer is if we're talking about universal basic income in terms of another benefit, to be honest, I think we've got enough. I mean, I'm tired even thinking about universal credit after tax credits, after income support. Yeah, the last thing I feel we need is yet another benefit. However, there are a couple of, when it comes to the kind of core principles behind universal basic income, I think there are a couple of really key principles there which are really, really important. So reducing means testing and reducing conditionality. And actually, happily, both of those things I think can be done within the current benefit system. There is a lot we can do, either to reduce means testing by reducing taper rates, or by introducing kind of universal or making certain benefits universal. So, for example, we used to have a universal children's benefit called child benefit. Obviously, that's no longer universal. So there'd be a question of, if we're going to start anywhere, maybe we should go back to having a universal children's benefit. And as for reducing conditionality, well, we've seen that that can be done because it was done during the course of the pandemic. And I think there's a really strong case for certainly making sure we don't see some of the sky-high rates of sanctions that we saw in the mid-2010s re-emerge in the near future, because that was a horrific period. And we really need to make sure that we're keeping an eye on that and reviewing what's being done around sanctions. So I think, no, I definitely don't think I want to see yet another benefit introduced, but at the same time, I think there's an awful lot we can do to introduce some of the good principles behind universal basic income within the current benefit system. And I really like the idea of some more what might call universal basic services, but kind of more universalism within services that we have. So I'd love to see universal free school meals, for example. I think the introduction of universal infant free school meals was fantastic. I think that every child, I don't think children stop eating at the age of 7, as far as I'm aware. So I don't know why universal free school meals stop at that point. And I think we need more universalism within childcare system, not least because calculating the way in which childcare benefits interact with people's income is just an absolute nightmare. And if we could just have universal childcare provision, it would just make life so much simpler. We have universal education over the age of 5. Why don't we have universal support for children under the age of 5? I don't understand it. So very strongly in favour of, at least in some areas, more universal provision being available.
Great, thanks very much. And Chris, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, I find normatively, I find the idea of UBI very attractive. I'm agnostic, I think, in political terms for 2 reasons really. One is that, as I think as Stewart and I were both saying, we really need to think about wealth and not income. So, well, I mean, I don't mean not income, I mean wealth. We need to think harder about wealth and how we can do something about the distribution of wealth. And the second point is just really to do with the politics. I'm not sure we can mobilize the support to get a decent UBI in place. And if we could mobilize that much political heft, then I'm not sure UBI is what I'd want to do with it. That's it.
Great, thanks very much. I think we might come, I've got a few questions about political support, but let me go to a question on housing and wealth inequality. Housing is one of the biggest contributors towards growing wealth inequality. Given this, what role can the welfare state play in levelling the playing field? Do we need to think more creatively beyond inheritance tax to new forms of asset or wealth tax? Chris, do you want to carry on with that? How do we deal with the fact that so much inequality is bound up in the housing?
Well, it's a huge question in terms of what you might do politically. One of the things I've spent time looking at quite closely in working on this book is just how much the nature of housing as an asset has changed in ways that we don't probably recognize. So we think there was a housing revolution back in the 1980s and that it grew, but the nature of the assets that people hold and the way that they're distributed and the change in forms of tenure, so the rise of private sector renting and the role that private sector renting plays in the wealth plans of the people who own as well as the people, makes it a very complicated kind of a field. As for the kind of policy options you might need to deal with that, I mean, I'm not sure that I know what those should be. I do think that somehow we have to find a way of returning resources into some kind of public sector or social sector housing. I don't think we can simply allow the tenure pattern to continue in the way that it's developed so far.
Thanks. Stewart, do you want to come in on this? You're still mute there.
I mean, just briefly, it's certainly true that I think it's something like about at least a third or maybe more of the total wealth mountain is held in the form of property. So if we were to increase taxation, a lot of it would hit housing. I mean, most of the increase in wealth that's happened over the last 20 years has actually been because of rising property prices. So prices have been rising at 2 or 3 times, the rate of income growth. That's unearned wealth. I mean, no one's done anything to earn it. So, I mean, I think there is a very clearly, the majority of people are not very keen on the idea of wealth taxes. But I think if we look at going on to the politics of this, if we look at the history of big changes over the last, 50, 60 years or longer, some of the most popular things today, like the National Health Service, like child benefit, like the national minimum wage, the campaigns to get them accepted took 20 or 30 years. I mean, the low pay unit, which was a branch of the Child Poverty Action Group, was set up in 1970 in order to make the case for a national minimum wage. So I think no government would dare take any of these things away. I mean, they mess about with them a bit, but essentially they're popular. So I think some of these ideas that are coming forward, that we need to harness some of this unearned wealth for the common good, and not just let a tiny proportion of the population take all the gains, is something that we really need a national debate on. And this could be transformative if we were able to because it's so big compared with income. Even modest taxes raise quite a lot. So yes, I think this could become a big issue of the 20s if we could harness some of this wealth and redistribute it. I mean, one of the things that I'm, been arguing for is that everybody should have an equity stake in the economy as a basic right. In other words, everybody has an equal stake, an equal ownership of a part of the economy. And obviously, people who are owner occupiers, they have a stake. But the 50% of people who don't, very few of them will have shares. They effectively have no stake in the economy. So I think we need to find ways of giving everybody an equal stake in the economy, and I think that could be, one way of doing this would be to create citizens' wealth funds, financed by wealth taxation and equity stakes in companies. I mean, so the government have poured all this money into firms over the last year, but none of that money has come with any conditions. There's no conditionality. There's conditionality associated, imposed on benefit recipients. Why are these firms, why are we not taking small equity stakes in the companies in return? There are ways of building and harnessing wealth, and I do think that this is the way forward. If we really want to build a stronger social state, it seems to me that's the route we have to go.
Okay, Sam, did you want to say anything on the wealth thing, or shall I pick out another question at this point?
Well, at its heart, it was a question about housing inequality, I think. And there are sides to that, of course. One is people with housing, who have housing wealth, and the other side is people who are treated very badly within the housing system. And one thing I would say is that we need to do much better through the social security system about supporting people with housing costs. I mentioned it was really welcome during the pandemic, the kind of resetting of local housing allowance to the 30th percentile of local rents. It wasn't enough. Back in 2010, it was the 50th percentile of local rents. And I remember complaining then that for many people that wasn't enough. And of course, we've still got kind of limits for both through housing benefit and the benefit cap, which further restrict the amount of help that people get. But it is really concerning that we're going back into a freeze. So if rents rise again, people are not going to see the support they're able to receive through local housing allowance keep up. We need to have a better deal for private renters, and we need to look really seriously at local housing allowance as part of that.
Good, thank you. Let's take a slightly different tack. And here's an intriguing question. It starts by saying, I am intrigued there's been no mention of the 1997 to 2010 government policies. Are we writing off those policies? Are there any lessons, positive or negative, to be learnt from that? Let's go back in time a little bit to that period of the Labour governments. Any lessons from there? Stewart?
Well, I mean, for me, the lesson of the Blairite government, did you say, the 1997 to 2010? Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, the lesson there was that Labour set out, this very ambitious scheme to eliminate poverty over 20 years. It sort of came out of the blue. They didn't really have much idea of how to implement it, but a lot of money went into it. I think the tax credit scheme cost something like over 20 billion. And what happened is that they very much took the Beveridge view, i.e. that you can solve poverty and not worry about inequality. And what happened under Labour was that they made quite a lot of progress with poverty, and then it started rising again towards the end. Of course, the Tories came in and did nothing and made things worse by withdrawing benefits and so on. And poverty's carried on, started to rise again quite sharply in the last 3 or 4 years. So I think that the main lesson for me is you cannot tackle poverty without tackling inequality. And if you try to do poverty on its own, then you will be fighting with one hand behind your back, because all the mechanisms that enrich people at the top also lower incomes at the bottom. And therefore, there's a limit to how much the tax benefit system can do. So what we do need is to tackle the institutional sources of inequality that are baked into the economic system. Without that, I really think progress will be limited.
Lessons?
Well, tax credits was a big lesson. I think that actually one of the things which may have been best during that period within the social security system, at least, was the introduction of tax credits and the way in which we learned to properly or better support people. I'd not go so far as say properly, but to recognise the importance of mixed income sources for people in work, so that a recognition that tax credits in work can be vital to supplement income earned through the labour market, in particular to address inequalities which can't be effectively met through the labour market. So additional support for people with disability, additional support for people with children. These are not additional costs which are going to be met through the labour market. You have to meet them as a result through the social security system if you're going to address them at all. And that means supporting people in work as well as people who are out of work. And I think tax credits was a really good lesson in terms of how to do that a little bit better, or at least take steps in the right direction. So that's something which I think, to a degree at least, has stuck. That recognition that you need to continue to support people in work as well as out of work through the social security system. It was at the heart of universal credit, or intended to be at the heart of universal credit. Unfortunately, so many problems with universal credit have undermined that core intent, and in many cases have made it, in some cases, even made it harder for people to stay in work rather than made it easier for people to stay in work by supplementing incomes through the social security system. But I think that was a really big lesson of 97 to 2010. I guess the other thing is actually going back to some of those points about universal basic services, the importance of the provision of basic services, for example, through things like Sure Start children's centres, which weren't cash cash support, but they were so vital to enabling people to enabling families with young children to give those children the best start in life, and provided a real part of that kind of mix of resource effectively within the household, which enabled people to have a reasonable standard of living.
Great, thanks very much. I mean, I very much agree. Just to chip in myself, I think you can learn a lesson that you can tackle child poverty. You can bring in effective measures. You can reduce child poverty, and you know, it's a goal that we shouldn't lose sight of. We've got 10 minutes to go. I've got loads of questions here. So, but I'm gonna go for a couple on modern monetary theory, which are really, I think, for you, Chris. How serious is the size of the national debt vis-a-vis the funding service provision, when the vast majority is now held by the de facto arm of the state, the Bank of England? Chris, I'm interested that you state there's been a crisis deterioration in public finances. What about the arguments and perspectives of modern monetary theory, which suggests no such problem exists within our public finances? So a bit technical, but I thought I'd give you a chance to have a go at those too.
Yeah, well, thank you. I'm very distressed to have been identified as the person to ask questions about economics. I know much more about New Labour than I do about economics. I'm aware of the argument that we don't need to worry about this anymore because servicing the debt is falling, and it is a remarkable feature, and it's one of the remarkable contrasts, I think, with 2008, which I'm sure your questioner is thinking of the fact that we have this colossal notional debt, but the cost of servicing it is very small because the numbers are so low. And I just think, well, good, right? So long as it lasts. But I know there is also, you know, some skepticism out there in the community who know about these things in a way that I don't, that makes us now also extremely vulnerable should that climate change. I mean, I talked about being old. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when interest rates were at 15% and Norman Lamont was singing in the bath. So I'm not certain that we can be confident these extraordinarily low rates would persist across time. And if they do, then all to the good. But I don't think it changes many of the other elements around what we need to change. So even if it's cheap to service our debt, good. We still need to change the way in which wealth is distributed, because the problem of poverty is not really addressed by that, I think.
I didn't mean to cut you off from saying something about New Labour.
No, it's absolutely fine. It's absolutely fine. No, it's absolutely fine. They can read the book.
Yeah, jolly good. Let's talk about how we're going to achieve change. So there's various different views about what change we might want to achieve, but let's just talk about the routes to it. So I'm interested in the role of narrative and framing as a route towards a new welfare state. How do we argue for it against powerful namesayers? Might we use security as a key thing we all yearn for, especially out of COVID-19? Let me add another one to that, which is raising similar sort of point. How will we make any progress in reforming the system with current first past the post system, together with an increasingly right-wing press which favours the current status quo? And linked to that, what can happen at the local level in terms of local and voluntary organisations in terms of tackling and making these arguments? So what's the route to really winning hearts and minds, if you like, in terms of making these changes? Sam?
Well, it's interesting. I was chairing a panel event earlier this week around health inequity during the course of the pandemic, and I asked quite a similar question to the panel. Well, I asked what had gone well during the pandemic, and the response was the same from everyone. Basically, it's been wonderful to see the sense of community that there's been over the last year. Wonderful to see the sense of community, that kind of solidarity, that sense of shared kind of genuinely wanting to support one another has come through. And for me, I feel that it's a reminder that when we make the case for something, it's so powerful to talk of community, to talk of shared purpose, how our lives are intertangled with one another's, and that every aspect of the welfare state is about that kind of, is really, when it comes down to it, about that kind of shared purpose, that shared sense of our lives. So for me, how we communicate about the importance of social security, about the welfare state, it has to come back to that sense of community and that sense of caring for one another at the heart of it.
Thank you. Chris.
Well, this question is even harder than the last one you asked me, I think. So I have to confess, I feel kind of, most of the time I feel pretty demoralized about this question, because when we think about, if we think about Beveridge, or we think about the immediate post-war period, we think about a Labour Party which was able to command close to 40% of the vote. And we think about trade unions, which were an effective force in a way that I fear they aren't now. So, and we know that Labour's new electoral base is kind of split between a kind of old base and a kind of new kind of metropolitan. So, and it's not clear that the interests that of these groups are entirely the same. But I think the state, as I said in my other remarks, I mean, I think the state is absolutely critical. I don't think you can do it without the engagement of the state. The one thing I think which is a note of optimism is the idea of generational change, right? I mean, I think that, you know, people of my generation may not do anything very effective, but there are people coming up behind who are disadvantaged in comparative terms, certainly compared to my generation, in terms of the welfare state, but in terms of other opportunities, in terms of housing opportunities as well. And I think, you know, some of the realities of the politics of that will make themselves felt through time. And if you look at the profile of voting for different parties, as we know, it's got a generational component to it. So I'm hoping that the passage of time will do some work, I think.
Fingers crossed. Stewart.
Well, I mean, it certainly looks sort of fairly bleak at the moment. To hope that we you know, we're going to get really radical change over the next few years. But I mean, I don't think the present system is sustainable. I mean, I don't think inequalities at current levels, rising levels of deprivation, rising levels of homelessness, you know, the sort of the erosion of opportunity that's happening. I mean, I think, and so if we need to capitalize, as Sam was saying, on the sort of change of public mood over the last year, which was certainly very different at the beginning. Whether it's still there, it's a bit more difficult to say. But I think we need. I mean, actually, I know it's a lot of people say. I mean, there's something like the spirit of the 1940s to inspire us. So we need someone to inspire us and get. But to me, one of the fundamental problem with Britain at the moment is that we are a heavily divided society. That the unemployed. I mean, even though we have high rates of employment, you know, the real situation in employment is very poor for a significant minority. Housing choices are very limited. You know, people with degrees can't get jobs. These feel to me to be issues that should be priorities for politics and government and campaigners and reformers. And I think the optimistic view is that we've done it in the past. You know, we have brought these transformative changes, the health service, child benefit, which was a very significant reform and brought in against the wishes of the Labour cabinet, as we know, and minimum wage. These have all been transformative. So I just think, you know, we need some countermeasures. You know, we need to build in some pro-equality measures into our society, into our economy. There's too many pro-inequality pressures. The tax system, the way business operates, the way the housing system operates. We need to counter those. I don't think if we allow inequality to carry on rising, and you know, we really fail to deal with some of the problems that have been exposed by COVID, I'm not sure that well, I don't know, but so I'm slightly optimistic, because I think that I mean, just looking at sort of basic income campaign, you know, I've been quite involved in something called the UBI Hub, which has started about a year ago, and there are over 30 hubs across Britain now campaigning for a basic income scheme. So there is a social movement in Britain for a basic income. There wasn't 18 months ago. Now I know it's controversial, basic income, but the principle is that you can, you know, get campaigns going around creating a better society. I think is shown by that.
Right, at that point, I think we're just about out of time, unfortunately. We've got loads of questions we haven't had time to address, and loads of issues that would be good to talk about. But our three panelists have been great in terms of their initial presentations and also the things that they've said. Let me just pick a couple of things out of the questions to put them as comments, final comments, as it were. So I'm being very selective here. We've got a comment about working with people with lived experience of social security to improve and change the system. How important is that in terms of thinking about our future? Something for us to think about. And also a comment about contribution-based benefits, very sidelined in recent years, but the furlough scheme suggests that there's at least some support for this approach. Could we be rebuilding on the contributory side as well? So a couple of perhaps my own hobby horses that I've added in at the end there. But my job as chair is to thank our three speakers for their excellent presentations, to remind you that you can buy their books at discount. It's up in the chat, all the details. So they're Policy Press books in detail on the chat, and also that the Bristol University Press are continuing this series of webinars, and the next one coming up is addressing inequality in education post COVID-19. So keep your eye out for that. Thank you all for your attendance and for your very thoughtful contributions. Sorry we didn't get to all your questions, but plenty for us all to go away and think about. Thanks a lot. Thanks again, speakers and everyone here. And we'll say goodbye at that point. Thank you.